The human whose name is written in this note shall die. The note will not take effect unless the writer has the person's face in their mind when writing his or her name. If the cause of death is written within the next 40 seconds of writing the person's name, it will happen. If the cause of death is not specified, the person will simply die of a heart attack. After writing the cause of death, details of the death should be written in the next 6 minutes and 40 seconds. This note shall become the property of the human world once it touches the ground. The owner of the note can recognize the image and voice of the original Shinigami. The human who uses this note can neither go to heaven nor hell. If the time of death is written within 40 seconds after writing the cause of death as a heart attack, the time of death can be manipulated. The person in possession of the death note is possessed by a Shinigami until they die. If a human uses the note, a god of death usually appears in front of him or her within 39 days after he or she uses the note. Gods of death, the original owners of the death note, do not do in principle anything which will help or prevent the deaths in the note. A god of death has no obligation to completely explain how to use the note or rules which will apply to the human who owns it unless asked. A god of death can extend their own life by putting names in their notebook, but humans cannot. The human who becomes owner of the death note can, in exchange for half of his or her remaining life, get the eyeballs of a Shinigami, which will enable him or her to see a human's name and remaining lifespan when looking through them. A Shinigami cannot be killed even if stabbed in the heart with a knife or shot in the head with a gun. However, there are ways to kill a god of death which are generally not known to the gods of death. The conditions for death will not be realized until it's physically possible for the human or is reasonably assumed to be carried out by that human. The specific scope of the condition for death is not known to the Shinigami either, so you must examine and find out. One page taken from the death note, or even a fragment of the page, contains the full effects of the note. The instrument to write with can be anything: blood, cosmetics, anything. Even the original owners of the death note, Shinigami, do not know much about the note. You may also write the cause and or details of death prior to filling out the name of the individual. Even if you do not actually possess the death note, you can still use it if you can recognize a name and face. The death note will not affect those under 780 days old, which is about 2-year-old babies. The death note will be rendered useless if the victim's name is misspelled 4 times. Suicide is a valid cause of death. Whether the cause of an individual's death is either suicide or an accident, if that death leads to the death of more than intended, the person will simply die on the spot of a heart attack. This is to ensure that other lives are not influenced. Even after the individual's name, the time of death, and the condition on the death note were filled out, the time and condition of death can be altered as many times as you want, as long as you change it within 6 minutes and 40 seconds from the time it was filled in. Whenever you want to change anything written on the death note, within 6 minutes and 40 seconds after you write it, you must first rule out the characters you want to erase with 2 straight lines. The time and condition of death can be changed, but once the victim's name has been written, the individual's death can never be avoided. If you lose the death note or have it stolen, you will lose its ownership unless you retrieve it within 490 days. If you have traded the eye power with the god of death, you will lose the eye power as well as the memory of the death note once you lose its ownership. At the same time, the remaining half of your life will not be restored. You may lend the death note to another person while maintaining its ownership. Subletting it to yet another person is possible too. The borrower of the death note will not be followed by the god of death. The god of death always remains the owner of the death note. When the owner of the death note dies while the note is being lent, its ownership will be transferred to the person who is holding it at that time. If the death note is stolen and the owner is killed by a thief, its ownership will automatically be transferred to the thief. When the same name is written on more than 2 death notes, the note which was first filled in will take effect, regardless of the time of death. If writing the same name on more than 2 death notes is completed within 0.06 seconds, it is regarded as simultaneous. The death note will not take effect and the individual written will not die. The Shinigami must at least own 1 death note. That death note must never be lent to or written on by a human. Exchanging and writing on death notes between gods of death is no problem. If a Shinigami decides to use the death note to benefit and favor an individual's life that will extend it, the god of death will die. The dead Shinigami will disappear, but the death note will remain. The ownership of this death note is usually carried over to the next god of death that touches it, but it is common sense that it is returned to the Shinigami king. Only by touching each other's death note can human individuals who own the death note in the human world recognize the appearance and voice of each other's god of death. By possessing the death note, an individual gains the ability to kill and stops being a victim. From this point, a person with the death note cannot see the lifespan of other death note owners, including him or herself. The god of death must not tell humans the names and lifespans of individuals he sees. This is to avoid confusion in the human world. It is a prerequisite for the death note used in the human world that a living god of death makes sure that the humans in the human world use it. It is very difficult to consider that a god of death who has possessed a human could die, but if he should die, the death note that he had brought into the human world will not lose its power. In order to see the names and lifespans of humans by using the eye power of a god of death, the owner must look at more than half of that person's face. When looking from top to bottom, he must look at least from the head to the nose. If he looks at only the eyes and under, he will not be able to see the person's name and lifespan. Also, even though some parts of the face, for example the eyes, nose or mouth, are hidden, if he can basically see the whole face, he will be able to see the person's name and lifespan. It is still not clear how much exposure is needed to tell the name and lifespan, and this needs to be verified. If the above conditions are met, names and lifespans can be seen through photographs and pictures, no matter how old they are, but this is sometimes influenced by the individual's size. Also, names and lifespans cannot be seen by face drawings, however realistic they may be. Those with the Shinigami eyes will have the eyesight of over 3.6 in human measurements, regardless of their original eyesight. The individuals who lose ownership of the death note will also lose their memory of the usage of the death note. Whenever an individual with ownership of more than 2 death notes loses possession of one of the death notes, he will not be able to recognize that death note's Shinigami appearance or voice anymore. The god of death himself will leave, but all the memories involving the death note will remain, as long as he maintains ownership of at least one other death note. The god of death must not stay in the human world without a particular reason. The death note must not be handed to a child under 6 years of age, but death notes that have been dropped into the human world and are a part of the human ecosystem can be used upon humans of any age with the same effect. If you just write "die of accident" for the cause of death, the victim will die from a natural accident after 6 minutes and 40 seconds from the time of writing it. Even though only one name is written in the death note, if it influences and causes other humans that are not written in it to die, the victim's cause of death will be a heart attack. If you write "die of disease" with a specific disease's name and the person's time of death, there must be a sufficient amount of time for the disease to progress. If the set time is too tight, the victim will simply die of a heart attack. If you write "die of disease" for the cause of death, but only write a specific time of death without the actual name of disease, the human will die from an adequate disease, but the death note can only operate within 23 days. This is called the 23-day rule. You cannot kill humans who are 124 or over with the death note. You cannot kill humans with less than 12 minutes left to live. The names you will see with the Shinigami eyes are the names needed to kill that person. You will be able to see the name even if that person wasn't given one. The number of pages in the death note will never run out. If a person loses possession of a death note, they will not recognize the Shinigami by sight or voice anymore. If, however, the owner lets someone else touch his death note, from that time on, that person will recognize the god of death. In accordance with the above, the human who touched the death note and began to recognize the god of death's sight and voice will continue to recognize it until that human actually owns the death note and subsequently loses possession of it. The owner of the death note cannot be killed by a Shinigami who is living in the Shinigami world. A Shinigami who comes down to the human world in the objective to kill the owner of the death note will also not be able to do so. Only a god of death that has passed on their death note to the human is able to kill said human. If a death note user accidentally misspells a name 4 times, that person will become free from being killed by the death note. However, if they intentionally misspell the name 4 times, the owner of the death note will die. The person whose name was misspelled 4 times on purpose will not be free of death by the Death Note. There are male and female gods of death, but it is neither permitted nor possible for them to have sexual relations with humans. The gods of death can also not have sex with each other. When regaining ownership of the Death Note, the memories associated with the Death Note will also return. You will lose memory of the Death Note when losing its ownership, but you can regain this memory by either obtaining the ownership once again by touching it. This can be done up to 6 times. If the 6 times are exceeded, the person's memory of the Death Note will not return and they will have to use it without any previous memory. Humans that have traded for the Shinigami Eye power will not be influenced by the Death Note. Humans that have the Shinigami Eyes cannot see the names or lifespans of humans that have already passed away by looking at their photos. Whenever a god of death who had been in the human world dies and the Death Note is left behind and picked up by a human, that person becomes the owner. However, in this case, only the human that can recognize the god of death and its voice is able to see and touch this Death Note. It is very unlikely, but if by any chance a Shinigami picks up the Death Note, that god of death becomes the owner. It is useless to try and erase the names written in the Death Note with an eraser. The use of the Death Note in the human world sometimes affects other human lives or shortens their original lifespan, even though their names are not actually written in the Death Note itself. In these cases, no matter the cause, the god of death sees only the original lifespan and not the shortened lifespan. If a Death Note is owned in the human world against the god of death's will, that god of death is permitted to stay in the human world in order to retrieve it. As long as the Shinigami has at least once seen a human and knows his or her name and lifespan, the god of death is capable of finding that human from a hole in the Shinigami realm. There are laws in the Shinigami realm. If a god of death should break the law, there are up to 9 levels of severity starting at level 8 and going up to level 1, plus the extreme level. For severity levels above 3, the gods of death will be killed after being punished. For example, killing a human without using the Death Note is considered an extreme level punishment. Shinigami will not die from lack of sleep. Moreover, gods of death do not really need sleep. The meaning of sleep for gods of death is essentially different from humans and is mere laziness. Only 6 Death Notes are allowed to exist at a time in the human world. This means only 6 Shinigami that have passed on their Death Note to humans can stay in the human world. One god of death is allowed to pass on Death Notes to only 3 humans at a time. It is possible for a single Shinigami to hand out up to 6 Death Notes, for example by handing 3 humans 2 Death Notes each. In other words, one human could own all 3 Death Notes. However, if a 7th Death Note is owned by a human in the human world, nothing will happen even if used. The Death Note will not take effect if you write a specific victim's name using several different pages. But the front and back of the page is considered as one page. For example, the Death Note will still take effect if you write the victim's surname on the front page and given name on the back. By manipulating the death of another human that has influence over another human's life, that human's original lifespan can sometimes be lengthened. If a Shinigami intentionally does the above manipulation to effectively lengthen a human's lifespan, the god of death will die. But even if a human does the same, the human will not die. In the Death Note, you cannot set the death date to longer than the victim's original lifespan. Even if the victim's death is set in the Death Note beyond his or her original lifespan, the victim will die before the set time. A human death caused by the Death Note will indirectly lengthen some other human's original life without the specific intention to do so. After a god of death has brought the Death Note to the human world and given its ownership to a human, that god of death has the right to kill the human using his or her own Death Note for reasons such as disliking the owner. Even if a new victim's name, cause of death, or situation of death is written on top of the original written name, cause of death, or situation of death, there will be no effect on the original victim's death. The same thing will also apply to erasing what was written with a pencil or whitening out what was written with a pen in attempt to rewrite it. Once the victim's name, cause of death, and situation of death have been written down in the Death Note, this death will still take place even if the Death Note or part of the Death Note in which it had been written in is destroyed. If the victim's name has been written and the death note is then destroyed in the middle of writing the cause of death, the victim will be killed of a heart attack within 40 seconds of writing the name. If the victim's name and cause of death have been written and the death note is destroyed, like burned in the middle of writing the situation of death, then the victim will be killed within 6 minutes and 40 seconds via the stated cause of death, if the cause is possible within that period of time, but otherwise, the victim will still just die of a heart attack. No matter what medical or scientific method may be employed, it is impossible for humans to distinguish whether or not the human has the eye of a Shinigami. Even other gods of death cannot distinguish this fact, except for the very god of death that has traded his or her power with that human. The following situations are the cases where a god of death that has brought the death note into the human world is allowed to return to the world of the death gods. 1. When the god of death has seen the end of the first owner of the death note brought into the human world and has written that human's name on his or her death note. 2. When the death note which has been brought in is destroyed. 3. If nobody claims ownership of the death note. 4. If for any reason the god of death possessing the death note has been replaced by another Shinigami. 5. When the Shinigami loses track of the death note which she or he possesses, cannot identify which human is owning the death note, or cannot locate where the owner is, and therefore needs to find such information through the hole in the world of the Shinigami. Even in situations 2, 3, and 4 above, gods of death are obliged to confirm the death of the first owner and write that human's name in his or her death note, even when he or she is in the world of the Shinigami. In the world of the Shinigami, there are a few copies of what humans may call a user guidebook for using the death note in the human world. However, the guidebook is not allowed to be delivered to humans. It is perfectly okay for gods of death to read the guidebook for him or herself and teach humans about its contents, no matter what the contents may be. Some limited number of death notes have white or red front covers, but they would make no difference in their effects as compared with the black cover death notes. All humans will, without exception, eventually die. After they die, the place they go is Mu, nothingness. Once dead, they can never come back to life.